Okay, welcome to the next lecture here for Chapter 4 on imperfections in solids. So up until this point, the understanding that we've taken to studying crystals of materials has been that there's a lot of perfection reflected in the unit cell and that this propagates throughout the bulk of the material. As you might have deduced at that moment, there is no such thing as a perfect repeat in infinite directions for any material. And so we have to start to understand some imperfections that might be present, such as substitutional atoms in place of other atoms in that unit cell or throughout the bulk of the material, missing atoms from a pattern reflected in a unit cell, or additional or interstitial atoms that are not otherwise predicted based on the formulary unit cell. All of these fall into what are called point defects, so certain specific spots, so zero-dimensional point defects. When we have collections of those that are out of the prediction that we would have by propagating the unit cell in all three dimensions, those might line up in a linear fashion, so a one-dimensional set of defects or a line defect, and we term this a dislocation. And lastly, kind of continuing on with our dimensionality here, the two-dimensional or an area type defect results in what are called grain boundaries, where we'll see certain orientations of sets of unit cells, if you want, neighboring one another, ultimately shifting in their arrangement to another area separated by a grain boundary. Okay, so as you've are well aware of, there's no perfection in most real materials, and so it's also impossible to have very, very pure materials. Okay, so or perfectly pure materials. So to help us with sort of this idea, as you know, we can mix materials, and when we mix water and alcohol like we do to make certain spirits, we have a pretty good understanding of what a liquid solution is, where the chemical composition that is in the alcohol ends up mixing with that of the water, and we end up with molecular scale mixing, where water, represented by sort of white spheres here, is randomly positioned in between ethanol molecules, shown here as a solid sphere. Okay, and so we're going to see something similar now when we look at metals in their solid state. So we can still use the term solution here, and we'll evolve away from liquids and consider solids as having the opportunity to solubilize something else. So a solution of metals, it can indeed be a solid. Okay. So here's our periodic table. Clearly we have lots of metals, and so we'll take a look at that. That's the sort of transition metal block in the middle. Specifically, we'll use an example to get us going. So we'll consider copper and nickel, neighbors in the periodic table. As we recall from trends in the periodic table, because these are neighbors in the periodic table, their size is going to be quite similar, as would be their electronegativity. And these are two criteria that help predict that they would mix well together in their solid state. Okay, so similar atomic size. If you look into the appendix of your textbook, you'll find that they share a common crystal structure, so that is their atomic packing into a cubic lattice is very similar, or the same exactly. And specifically, this means that they both adopt a face-centered cubic crystal structure. Okay, so taking the ideas of liquid alcohol mixing with liquid water to make a solution that was liquid we can apply this here now to the copper and nickel metals in their solid, and we can have these occupy random spots in the lattice of the face-centered cubic lattice. So in this case, the minority material appears to be nickel here because there are fewer blue spheres in the diagram above. And the majority compound or atom is copper. And you can see that we are adopting a face-centered cubic crystal reflected here by the top-down view of the 100 section of the unit cell. And we can see here that in the one I drew, the nickel is positioned at the face. However, in other unit cells nearby, we have a shift of that nickel to a different site in that unit cell. And so here's the randomness that we observed in liquid ethanol mixing with liquid water. Okay. So just to familiarize ourselves with some ideas here, let's see if we can tackle this question. So this might be where you pause the video once you've had a chance to reflect on the question and set of answers. So the question is, which one is the correct statement? Here we have a depiction with copper and nickel. And we might ask, is statement A, where copper is the solute and nickel is the solvent? Is that correct? Or is it vice versa? Nickel is the solute and copper is the solvent. Or perhaps it's different, and it's in option C, both copper and nickel are the solvent, and there is no solute. Or perhaps it's option D, where both copper and nickel are the solute, and there is no solvent. So take a moment to reflect on that, given what we've covered so far, and see if you can determine the correct answer. Resume the video when you're ready. Okay, so hopefully you settled on this answer being the correct answer. We can see here by number population of atoms, nickel is the dominant one, so we would regard that as being the solvent. Nickel is the solvent, is correct. And the minority atom in this mixture is the copper. It has fewer counts for the atom population throughout this lattice, and so it is the solute. So statement A is correct. Okay, so what we saw here is that copper and nickel are randomly dispersed according to the overall composition. So we could ask in this case, the copper solvent to host increasing amounts of nickel per our formulation, our recipe. Ways of reflecting that might be to show that that the atoms are kind of mixed, and so we could either show that by shading in between the two colors of the two options, or showing exact specific spots if possible. So in a similar system, here's gold and copper. You can see here that this system, we depending on temperature, can shift between a disordered solid solution of copper and gold, or if the temperature condition is correct, we can actually favor more order by positioning all copper atoms at the faces of an FCC lattice, as shown at right. So for this unique system, copper and gold, above 390 degrees, you might expect there to be more disorder because we've applied energy to scramble the two atoms within the materials. Notice here we're not in a molten state, we're still solid, so we still adopt unit cells and have structural order of atoms. But the two atoms are located randomly throughout the lattice, as we've reflected here with the shading of the two atoms. Okay, so an average position of copper and gold is reflected in that disordered diagram. At a lower temperature, we don't have the sort of thermal energy applied to the system, and the system might fall into a more ordered state as a consequence. So here below 390 C, the copper atoms can occupy the face-centered positions of a face-centered cubic lattice. Okay, so we've seen a lot of different ideas at this point, so let's introduce a set of terms here. So we've talked about solid solutions. So these are in fact solids, not molten states of these metals. And we have the idea of a substitutional solid solution. So a substitution of some of the metals by the solute while still adapting that solvent's crystal structure. So here, an atomic scale combination of more than one kind of atom with the solute atom substituting for a solvent atom in that lattice site is what we define as a substitutional solid solution. Okay, and we've reflected that through a depiction here where there's randomness in the solute and the solvent lattice, or a disordered option here to reflect that as well. And outside of that, those random positions of the solute into the solvents lattice, certain materials can order and establish new sets of compounds. Okay, the ordered option here has substitutional displacement of one set of atoms, but it's ordered, and it would not be a solid solution as reflected with the disordered ideas seen in the latter, in the former two drawings. Okay. So we opened with the idea of copper and nickel, and we saw a similar system in copper and gold. And you might be curious of what are the requirements for such atoms to substitute into the lattice of one another. And so we can consider size as an important factor there. At some point, if atoms are small enough, they may not substitute for another atom's position in a lattice, but rather occupy the interstitial sites that we spent a little bit of time on in this course. And so atom size is a clear factor here. Take, for example, the option of carbon. Because it is so much smaller than the metal of iron in alpha iron, that carbon will actually dissolve into the interstitials and locate itself at the half position in the body-centered cubic lattice of iron. So notice that we do have, in sort of white and gray, we have iron atoms. And that there's an additional atom in this cube, so we've exceeded the BCC of pure iron, and we now included an additional half carbon atom that we're pointing to in this drawing. Okay, so the size of carbon being small may allow for that. To help us with solid solutions, substitutional solid solutions, for getting metals to mix with metals, we have the Hume-Rothery rules, and they're reflected here. So these are guidelines. They're not cut and dry, and at times we have to take them all holistically and negotiate certain conditions. So do be careful treating these as absolute, rigorous boundaries for mixing or not mixing of the two metals. The first guideline from the Hume-Rothery rules is that we would like the two metals that are going to act to mix randomly with one another to establish a solid solution with substitution, is that we'd like the radii to be within 15% of one another. So typically you take the difference in the radii of the two metals divided through by the radius of the solvent and multiply by 100%. And if that outcome is less than 15%, then the size requirements for establishing a substitutional solid solution are validated. So one can fit nicely into the other without compromising the structure too much. Second rule is we would like the two materials being asked to mix to have similar electronegativity, and we know that we recognize that by finding those two materials, those two atoms in question, at similar positions in the periodic table. Often we can turn to additional resources like a periodic table of electronegativity values, and so we saw in, for example, copper and nickel have very similar electronegativity values as reflected by their neighboring positions in the periodic table. Okay, so again, we want similar electronegativities if one metal is to mix into the positions of the other metal's lattice. Third, it would be beneficial if both separate pure metals have similar atomic packing in their unit cells at the same temperature conditions. So if we're asking one metal to mix in nicely with the other, if they both want to establish the same unit cell at that temperature, then we might expect the two to integrate nicely to one another. Okay, so same crystal structure for the pure separate metals would again be a favorable criteria to predict mixing in a substitutional solid solution. Lastly, we need to think about valency, or what is also known as oxidation number. As you may know, things like iron can have a +2 or a +3 state, and these valence numbers, if significantly different than the other metal, would tend to favor poor mixing. So in other words, if in the case of nickel being asked to be hosted into copper, if their valency or oxidation number is similar, as they are, usually 1+ for each of those, then the two would mix nicely. Okay. Sorry, a moment ago I said 2+ for each of those. Apologies. So here's the case for copper and nickel, which we opened with. Here you can see the radii. So notice the radii are very close. So the difference of 0.003 divided by the solvent, doesn't matter which one, the difference is so small that we will certainly be below 15% difference, and nickel will be easily hosted into copper by that argument, and vice versa. The two unit cells, they both adopt face-center cubic lattices when pure at the same temperature, and so these two would also satisfy this Hume-Rothery rule for mixing. And lastly, most ions, when these form ions, they tend to form the 2+ state, and sometimes 1+ in the event of copper, and therefore have similar valency or oxidation number. And this favors mixing in the two pure metals, asking the two pure metals to mix.